everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Today I'm going to show you how to install a Delta Faucet R2707, a deck mount rough for Roman tubs. Now with this type of rough, the thickness of your deck can change your installation steps. So take a quick minute to estimate what your total deck thickness is. And what I mean by total deck thickness is from the bottom of your framing to the top of your finished deck surface, something like a solid stone or a tile. Now if the total thickness of your deck is more than 2.5 inches and the top surface layer is less than 2.5 inches, you're going to install the rough following the thick deck or thick tile steps. We're going to walk through those steps together here, so stay tuned. Now if on the other hand your deck is standard, meaning the total thickness of those deck materials is less than 2.5 inches, then we have a different video for that. Typically, you'd only be tackling this project if you're doing a bathroom remodel that's been taken all the way down to the studs, or you're doing new construction. Now, if you're tackling that complicated of a project, I'm guessing you have some DIY experience. Just keep in mind that every install is unique and building codes are different everywhere. So if you run into an issue or there are any steps of the install that you're uncomfortable with, I definitely recommend bringing in a professional for some extra help. But if you feel good with it, then let's get started and talk about what tools you're going to need. Then we can move on to the install. For our installation today, you'll need a power screwdriver, a tape measure, a level, an adjustable wrench, a pencil, a 2-inch hole saw, a utility knife, safety goggles or glasses, and then whatever plumbing is appropriate for your water supply. You're also going to need to pressure test your rough valve, so you'll need the appropriate caps for your tub and shower fittings. Okay, let's get to it. Alright, so I want to take a quick moment just to give you an example of a thick deck installation. Now a thick deck installation is classified as any time you're installing your valves on framing and finished material that's going to be greater than 2.5 inches. So I've got my mock-up here, and the first thing I've done is to draw a center line where I want my valves and my spout to be centered. Next, I'm going to drill 2-inch holes down through at my mark locations. Now I want to talk about the mark locations for a second because this is very important. You always want to check the information with your finish trim to determine what the minimum spacing will be for your application. But in general, it's going to be between 10 and 16 inches to the centers of your outside holes. That's where your two valves are going to go. And then once I've got those marked, I've just marked the center line for my spout as well and drilled my 2-inch holes all the way down through my deck. So I'm going to start by dropping in my cold side here. And before I do that, I want to talk about the end valve quickly. You'll notice there's 2 tubes coming out of the bottom. First one is this corrugated side, and that's going to end up connecting back to our spout in the middle hole. And the other side is this smooth one, that's where we're going to connect our water supply. So when we mount this to our deck, we want to make sure the corrugated tube is facing the center of my installation. So this is my cold side. I'm going to go ahead and drop it down into my hole. Next, I'm going to grab my hot side, and I can tell this is the hot side because it has a little sticker on the input tube that tells me so. Again, making sure my corrugated tube is facing towards the spout. And then finally, I'm going to drop my spout adapter into place, and this doesn't really have a front or a back, so either way is just fine. Now before I secure these in place, there's one more dimension I want to point out to you, and that's the fact that we want to make sure our finished material, that means any cement board or tile or whatever material you're using here, isn't going to exceed 2.5 inches off the top of this deck. And that's the same dimension as from this little plate on the bottom, that dimpled plate, to the bottom of the top washer. So as long as we're under 2.5 inches, everything should come together perfectly. Next, we're going to secure our end valves and our spout adapter down to our deck. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reuse my center line that I used when I was drilling my original holes. I'm just going to rotate my dimpled plates until the little screw holes are right along the line. And what this is going to do is help ensure that my end valves and my spout are going to be perfectly in line and look great when I apply my trim down the road. Okay, now that I'm happy with that position, I'm going to go ahead and secure them to my deck using these included screws and my drill. Okay, I've got those all screwed into place and everything's nice and snug to my deck. Now I can start making my plumbing connections. Now before I do that, I do want to talk through these connections because there's a couple things we need to point out. First, as you remember I talked about the corrugated supply lines before. These corrugated pipes are going to be the ones that bend towards the middle here and connect to our spout adapter. Now to do that, I have a little T that I'm going to connect to the bottom of the spout adapter and then bend each side towards the middle and then connect it to the bottom of that T. Now, even though this is a corrugated pipe and is designed to bend, we still want to be very, very careful with it to make sure we don't kink it or break it in any way. Once I've got those connected, I can move on to connecting my cold and my hot supplies. Now, I also want to talk about these for a second because As this end valve gets tightened to the deck, it's actually going to drop down towards the top of the deck to keep a nice, tight, secure connection between your framing and the deck itself. So as that whole valve drops down, that means your input tube is going to drop as well. So however you're connecting this with plumbing, be it PEX or copper, you want to keep that future drop in mind, so you make sure you're allowing enough leeway for whatever plumbing you have connected to drop as well, so we get a nice, tight, secure connection. Okay, I've got everything set up and ready to go, so I'm going to go ahead and make those connections and then come back here for the next step. Okay, now that we have our plumbing installed, now what we can do is pressurize our system and check for leaks. And so what I'm going to do is run some water in here and then check all of my connections to see if I'm seeing any evidence of leaking. So I'm going to check each side of my T connection here at the bottom of my spout adapter, and then also the inputs on my cold and hot side. Now, if I see any evidence of leaks, I want to make sure I take care of those now, because this is really going to be my last opportunity to get easy access to this. If everything looks good, we'd probably be pausing here and letting some other trades come in and doing our finished surfaces and building up the deck before we get to the final steps. However, I do want to talk through those steps because it's important you understand how it's all going to come together and also relay some important information to anybody who's going to be doing the finished surfaces. Okay, so the first thing you'll see in my mock-up here is I've got 1/2 inch of cement board and then a tile that's going to act as my finished surface. Now, it's important to remember that any additional layer you add to the top of this deck, you want to make sure it's as close to these cardboard tubes as possible. We need a nice tight fit there. So if you're tiling, you want to make sure you're bringing your tile up to tight to either side, and anything else. Now, often if you're using like a large format tile or even like a solid surface such as a stone, you may need to drill a hole through that surface and then drop it down over the valves and the spout adapter. If that's the case, you're going to need to remove these washers on the top of each item. Now, to remove the washer, it's very easy. All you do is turn it 90 degrees and then lift it up and off. Then that way it gives you enough leeway to drop your surface or your tile down around the tube. And then you want to reinstall the washer. You can just grab the top of your valve here, bring it up tight, and then turn it 90 degrees to lock it back into place. All right, so once you get your finished surface all done, now it's time to secure your valves and your spout adapter to the deck itself. So to do this, how this is going to work is basically we're going to cut this cardboard tube, which is going to allow the valve or the spout adapter to drop down a little bit. And then we're going to basically tighten a couple screws and sandwich this top washer down on top of our surface. And it's going to tighten up with that plate that we secured in an earlier step, making a nice tight connection. So now that I've talked through it, I'm going to show you how to do it right now, starting with trimming our cardboard tubes. Now, to cut the tubes, I'm going to be using a utility knife. However, any similar knife will work just fine. The important thing is to remember that you don't want to damage your finished surface while you do this, so just be very careful as you're cutting the tubes all the way around. Now that I have my cardboard tubes cut, it's time to start sandwiching everything down and tightening down our end valves and our spout connector. Now, I do want to point out, you'll notice each valve and the spout connector has 2 long threaded screws here, one on the front and one on the back. What we're going to do is twist our top washers until the screws line up with little notches. And when we do this, the entire assembly is going to want to drop down into the deck and start sitting flush on top of our finished surface. Now again, this is where it came really handy that we left a little bit of leeway down in our supply lines to allow that drop to happen without causing any problems with our plumbing down below. All right, now as that comes back down towards the top of the deck, next we're going to tighten up each one of these screws, and that will help compress everything between our finished surface and hold everything nice and snug. Now, I don't want to over tighten these, but I do want them pretty snug, and as I tighten up these screws, I want to make sure I'm working my way back and forth because we don't want to get too off angle here and causing things to bind up as we tighten these up. So I'm going to use a flathead drill bit and my screw gun here, and then gently start tightening up each of the valves and the spout connector. Okay, now what you'll notice is as I'm tightening these screws, they're actually going to drop down below the deck. So these aren't bolts, they're going to press everything down, they're actually pushing down the entire valve body assembly and causing pressure with this washer at the top, and that's how we're getting the pressure for the sandwich. So keep on driving these down below the deck surface, and you'll feel things start to tighten up. And we don't want to over tighten these again, just keep them snug enough to hold everything in place without damaging your finished surface. Okay, you'll see that got nice and tight, the washer isn't wiggling at all, and that completes our first valve. Now I'm going to complete the same exact steps for the spout adapter and the other end valve. Okay, everything feels nice and snug, and now we're ready to install our trim. So that about wraps things up for the thick deck installation of your Roman tub rough valve. All right, I hope everything went well with that install, and if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to Delta Faucet's customer service team. They're more than happy to help.